A wave of Israeli bombings devastates the Jenin refugee camp. More than 25 Palestinians killed in the operation in the occupied West Bank launched after the Gaza ceasefire. Is Donald Trump's comeback emboldening Benjamin Netanyahu to annex more Palestinian territory? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Benjamin Netanyahu has reiterated his pledge to redraw the map of the Middle East. The Israeli Prime Minister is in the United States, where he'll be the first world leader to meet Donald Trump in his second term. Netanyahu believes working closely with the president will help him to further change the face of the region after the war on Gaza ends. But weeks after signing the ceasefire agreement with Hamas, Israel has ramped up attacks on refugee camps in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli army says the operation has been launched to prevent the building of terrorist infrastructure. Experts warn the military raids are aimed at annexing more Palestinian territory. Is Donald Trump's return to the White House encouraging Netanyahu to push ahead with his dream of a greater Israel? And what does all this mean for the future of Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank? We'll discuss all these questions with our guests shortly, but first this report from Joel Evans.
As hundreds of thousands of Palestinians return to their homes across Gaza and the fragile ceasefire approaches its second phase, Israeli bombs rain down on the occupied West Bank. For the last 2 weeks, the Israeli military have been carrying out raids across the occupied West Bank, saying they're necessary to prevent terrorist infrastructure from being established. Large numbers of Israeli troops have entered the city and its refugee camp, and are supported by drones, helicopters and armoured bulldozers. Hundreds of Palestinian families have again been forced from their homes.
They started to call us via the drone to leave the neighbourhoods and head to Alder Square. So we went towards the square. I went with my mother and my family. They detained me. They put me inside a room.
Much of the Israeli military's focus has been on Jenin, where entire residential buildings, roads and other infrastructure has been destroyed. The Israeli military say it has killed at least 50 Palestinian fighters since raids began. But civilians have also been killed, including 2-year-old Layla al-Khatib.
They started to shoot at us through the windows without any warning. All of a sudden, the special forces raided us and were shooting through the windows.
With the military operation ongoing, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has travelled to Washington, D.C. He's the first foreign leader to visit President Donald Trump since his inauguration last month, and despite an arrest warrant being issued against him by the International Criminal Court.
The decisions we made in the war have already changed the face of the Middle East. Our decisions and the courage of our soldiers have redrawn the map. But I believe that working closely with President Trump, we can redraw it even further and for the better.
Among their discussion will be the implementation of the Gaza ceasefire's second phase. But for Palestinians across the occupied West Bank, the future is uncertain. Many continue to live in fear for their lives and their future, and wonder if they'll survive. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss this further with our panel of guests today. In San Francisco, Professor Stephen Zunis. He's Professor of Politics at the University of San Francisco. In Tel Aviv, Marev Zonshine is Senior Israel Analyst at the International Crisis Group. And in Ramallah, Javier Abu Eid, political scientist and former senior advisor to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us today. If I start with you, Marev, we've seen this operation by Israel centering on Jenin over the last couple of weeks. The official reason of the clampdown seems to be to respond to a spate of shootings and stabbings in recent weeks and to crack down on what they say is Hamas. But some are speculating it might also be to appease Israeli settlers who, when there was that Gaza ceasefire deal, went on a rioting rampage. What's your view on exactly what Israel's doing and why it's doing it?
Thanks. Well, it's hard not to pay attention to the fact that Israel started this operation and really restricted movement in the West Bank and started a lot more of what it's already been doing for a long time, but at a much accelerated pace right as the Gaza ceasefire went into effect. So as you alluded, it certainly looks like a signal to the far right, a kind of quid pro quo. We're going to stop in Gaza. Basically, Netanyahu was forced into a ceasefire by Trump. That is our understanding, my understanding of the situation. And so they've ramped it up in the West Bank to, show that they're still in control and that they're still dictating the terms. Now, they're not talking about eradicating Hamas in Jenin or in the West Bank because it's not really about Hamas there. It's all kinds of cross-factional and unaffiliated groups. These are very young men who only know occupation and they only know Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas. But it's very clear that Israel is trying to do the same kinds of things that it's done in Gaza in terms of evacuating people, ruining roads and infrastructure, making it very hard to live there. And yet, I don't think we will expect different results. They've done these kinds of operations on lesser scales over and over again. I think the third time in the last 2 years. They've operated in Jenin so many times, and it never seems to create the result that they want. So I don't necessarily expect this to be any different.
Marev, could I just check with you, though? You say it's not Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We've had all sorts of other groups, Al-Aqsa Martyrs, Lion's Den. Are you saying this isn't really any organised group at all?
I mean, I'm sure that my colleagues and others can speak more to what's happening within Palestinian society because I cover the Israeli side. But yes, what I'm saying is that it's not about eradicating Hamas. It's about what the IDF is talking about is eradicating terror and terror cells. And those terror cells might identify more or less with Islamic Jihad or other members, but they're not really identified with specific groups. And this is all over the West Bank. Like you said, there's other types of groups and they recruit quickly and they come up quickly. So it's not the same as in Gaza, but in Israel, they're talking about it in kind of the same type of language, that they need to eradicate what's growing in Jenin.
Javier, 70 Palestinians killed in the West Bank since the beginning of the year. If it wasn't for the attention on the war in Gaza, I mean, this is huge, isn't it? I mean, what's been going on in the West Bank since October the 7th really has been overlooked by much of the world.
It is a huge number, but I think when October the 7th took place and some Western countries ran to tell Mr. Netanyahu that he had the right to self-defense, I think many of us expected what was going to happen, not only in Gaza, and we were very clear, this is a war against the Palestinian people. And the main goal the Israeli government has is not about one group or the other, it's about how to keep denying systematically the Palestinian right to self-determination. And that can be seen the most here in the occupied West Bank. So this is not about what happened before or after October the 7th. We're talking about a system of colonial settler occupation that you can see all over the occupied West Bank. And over the past weeks has been even strengthened through almost 900 movement restrictions that have made daily life in the occupied West Bank extremely difficult for people, have limited the movement of people between different cities, and that goes in parallel with an increase on Israeli settler terror attacks almost all over the occupied West Bank, but particularly on areas that under the Trump administration's plan or the previous administration plan that they referred to as deal of the century, or that we can talk about the annexation plan, it was supposed to be annexed for Israel. We're talking mainly about the Jordan Valley and areas in and around occupied East Jerusalem.
Stephen, since that ceasefire deal in Gaza on the 19th of January, the day before President Trump was inaugurated, we've seen pictures in Gaza of Hamas gunmen, lots of them on the streets. Do you think this military operation, in part, is a distraction by Netanyahu to keep his right wing satisfied?
Well, it's clear they did not defeat Hamas. Just like they're not going to defeat the resistance in the West Bank. The resistance, whether it be in the form of Hamas or some secular groups or spontaneous cells or whatever, is a result of occupation, of siege, of the failure to grant Palestinians the right of self-determination or equality. And so this idea that if we just keep hitting, that somehow things will get better, somehow things will work, is nonsense. But I think you're correct in that there is some political side to this, that they're certainly trying to appease the right wing, and the right wing really does have a carte blanche now, especially with Trump lifting the limited sanctions that the Biden administration had placed on them several months ago. I think not that it stopped the attacks. There were over 1,400 attacks after Biden imposed the sanctions. But as long as the settlers keep terrorizing the community is going to strike back.
Now, I want to show something that was said a couple of weeks ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was speaking there, and as ever, on behalf of the international community, he stressed the need for a two-state solution. But he said he feared there was another possibility. Listen, because I think his comments here are very telling.
The other possibility is for Israel, feeling emboldened by the military successes that it has had, to think that this is the moment to do the annexation of the West Bank and to keep the Gaza in a kind of a limbo situation with an unclear form of governance. It is clear for me that Israel is not fundamentally interested in Gaza, it's fundamentally interested in the West Bank.
Marev, those last words there, it's clear for me that Israel is not fundamentally interested in Gaza, it's fundamentally interested in the West Bank. Would you agree with that assessment from the UN Secretary-General?
Well, I would certainly say that Israeli government has an open agenda of annexing the West Bank. And in Gaza, it's a different story. But Israel's policies, as we've seen them, are to displace and disrupt Palestinian livelihood everywhere. So that is common to both Gaza and the West Bank, and Israel's de facto control of both territories, continued control over decades to various degrees and levels, is also common. But I think it's true that in many ways the far right, while it has set its sights on resettling Gaza, that seems to be much less possible now that residents in Gaza have moved back up north and there's a ceasefire and Trump has kind of a different vision now. And I think what we need to pay attention to is that the West Bank is already under de facto annexation. I mean, Israel already, especially in the last couple of years under Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who has also started to move authorities from the military into civilian hands, and is very, very open about what he's trying to do. So, there's no question here that this is what Israel is doing. And I think what we need to think about is whether it's in Netanyahu's interest to actually formally annex the West Bank. Last time he threatened to do so, he got the Abraham Accords. And I think for Israel, for the practical right wing in Israel, it's more in their interest to de facto annex the West Bank and not make it formal, because then they'll have to answer to a lot more legal questions that they don't need to deal with today.
Javier, you're in Ramallah. You are living through this. You're well aware, as our viewers are, I think, that Israel staged a 10-day raid on the West Bank, focusing on Jenin again last summer in August and September. And then, in recent weeks, the Palestinian Authority has been carrying out its own raid in a very public way, with armoured vehicles going through the streets of Jenin. The spokesman for the Palestinian Authority operation said the aim was to put an end to sedition and chaos. What message was the Palestinian Authority, in your view, trying to send with that operation?
Probably the Palestinian Authority was trying to send a message to the Trump administration with regards to the willingness it has to have an effective control. But I think the most important element here is that the Israeli government has been weakening not just any sort of Palestinian organization on the ground, but the Palestinian Authority itself. It's virtually impossible for any government to have an effective control here in the occupied West Bank under the measures of the Israeli government. Let's remember that the Israeli government still is confiscating hundreds of millions that belong to the Palestinian Authority, and at the same time, it's making very difficult for the PA to function with the problems they are facing regarding movement between different Palestinian areas.
Stephen, a year ago, the US and the EU were demanding that there was a reinvigorated leadership of the Palestinian Authority. And almost a year ago, a new Prime Minister, Mohammed Mustafa, was appointed to lead the Palestinian Authority. Isn't the reality, though, the PA is probably weaker than ever?
Very much so. The combination of its own corruption and the view that increasing view that they are essentially collaborators with the Israelis, their inability to stop the war in Gaza, and the aging leadership in terms of President Abbas has certainly hurt its authority. In addition to the militant groups, though, you also have a growing civil society movement. You have a lot of nonviolent resistance and alternative institutions and other actions from the bottom up that are challenging not just the Israeli occupation, but many aspects of the PA's rule as well. But the problem, of course, is that in the current situation where most of the land remains under foreign control, where the world's greatest superpower is blocking the United Nations from enforcing its resolutions, where the United States has its contradictory role of being the chief mediator in the conflict and the chief military, economic, and diplomatic supporter of the occupying power. Really, there's no Palestine Authority one could think of, even with a fairly competent technocrat in the Prime Minister's office. It's an impossible situation, really, for anybody.
And Marev, the other factor, of course, is the UN body that deals with the Palestinians. UNRWA has now been banned by the Israelis. If you don't have a functioning UNRWA, you have a barely functioning Palestinian Authority, you have an economy that is wrecked. I mean, what does it leave for people living in the West Bank? I mean, how are they even going to get basic services?
Yes, I mean, Israel's law against UNRWA went into effect this week, a few days ago, and they were evacuated basically from their offices in Jerusalem, and their future is unclear. Obviously, the most urgent situation is the humanitarian and the services and the education that UNRWA provides. But I think what Israel is really doing here, and again, it's very open and clear in terms of the government's agenda. This is part of its just destruction of the Palestinian people. And in doing what they're doing to UNRWA, they're basically saying that there aren't Palestinian refugees. This isn't something that we're ever going to deal with. And it's a political issue. So this is part of Israel's campaign also to diminish or even collapse the Palestinian Authority, even though the military relies very heavily on the PA for what it does in services in the West Bank. But, Israel, there is no alternative for UNRWA right now in the occupied territories. And so this is going to create more unemployment, more violence, more chaos. And arguably, it's not in Israel's security interest to do so.
And of course, Javier, the settlements go on. Land continues to be taken by Israel. Who is actually leading this operation for Israel? Because it seems that the finance minister, Smotrich, seems to have not a formal role, but he seems to be calling the shots in the West Bank. Would you say he's effectively now the governor of the West Bank?
I think I would fully agree with that assessment, and I would just add that the Israeli government seems to be guided by a document made by Mr. Smotrich back in 2017, where he basically provided Palestinians with three options. They either accept to remain under occupation and apartheid with no rights, or ethnic cleansing, which is something that President Trump seems to be endorsing now in the case of Gaza, or if none of those work, then he would talk about the military solution. And when we talk about the military solution, it's very similar to what's happening in Gaza. What I'm just trying to say is that people here in the occupied West Bank are extremely concerned, and some of them are really afraid that the scenes we have witnessed in Gaza are going to be repeated here for the sake of this ongoing annexation process. And I think most importantly at this stage, which is the survival of the Netanyahu government that is taking place through the suffering and the denial of rights of the Palestinian people.
Stephen, I mean, it seems to me as Netanyahu meets Trump, there are two possible scenarios. Maybe there are more, but the main ones to me are that Trump pushes ahead with the Abraham Accords, gets Saudi Arabia to join the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and, well, Sudan is probably a little bit of a moot point given the country's been in civil war for nearly 2 years. He pushes ahead with that, and if Saudi was to agree with that, then we wouldn't have West Bank annexation and displacement of people from Gaza. But that's the other option that many in the Israeli cabinet would like to see. Which way do you think Trump is going to go?
Well, Trump will certainly try to push for a deal with Saudi Arabia, but even Saudi Arabia, as authoritarian as it may be, can't ignore the views of 98% of their population, which I think would oppose recognizing Israel without recognizing Palestinian statehood as well, a viable state alongside Israel. So I think he will. The alternative would be essentially to give Netanyahu a blank check, either for outright annexation or increasing the de facto annexation. I think we will see increasing violence. We're going to see a situation like we did in South Africa in the 1980s with the war in the townships. Or to use another analogy from that period, El Salvador, where the United States, allowed the death squads in collusion with the Salvadoran military to engage in ongoing massacres. So I think as long as Trump is in here, I cannot expect him to push Israel to moderate in any way whatsoever. And I think it's going to be up to the international community and the American civil society to rise to the occasion and do what we can to make sure such a horrible scenario doesn't take place.
Marev, in Trump's first term, Netanyahu got absolutely everything he wanted, moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, recognised Israeli control of the Golan. He had the Kushner proposal, which, of course, didn't go anywhere particularly, but it was very favourable to Israel. And he got the Abraham Accords. But now the next stage of the Abraham Accords could potentially, could it not, be a difference between Netanyahu and Trump, given the electoral calculations and the political calculations of the coalition in Jerusalem?
Yes, well, you have a kind of very different dynamic now between Netanyahu and Trump, right? Trump is in his second term. He's come out very clearly for the ceasefire. He's put his weight behind it and for the hostage deal. Israelis are relying more on Trump than on Netanyahu to get their fellow citizens out of Gaza. And you have this conflicting kind of vision that Trump seems to be putting forward of a mega deal with Saudi normalization. But how do you get that without giving serious concessions to the Palestinians? As Stephen was talking about, there's no way to kind of square that circle. And you have people in Trump's administration who are greater Israel annexationists, like Huckabee, like Elise Stefanik, and Netanyahu wants to survive in his coalition. So if he's going to continue with the Gaza ceasefire, he's going to have to give something else in return. So it's very unclear. And of course, the Saudis as well are not going to be able to move quickly on this because they're going to have to see serious measures taken. And first and foremost, a complete withdrawal of IDF from Gaza and like a permanent end to this war. And on the other hand, we still have Hamas in power there, which is something that Israel and Netanyahu don't want. The Saudis presumably don't want. Trump doesn't want. Maybe that's their one major commonality. But it's unclear how all the pieces of this puzzle are going to come together. And right now it seems completely unreasonable. But I would say that I think Trump has a different vision than Netanyahu right now. And so that's a very interesting dynamic that we're going to have to see how it plays out.
Well, Stephen, taking that point on, if Trump has a slightly different vision from Netanyahu, you might argue, as Marev said, where she mentioned some of the names, that some of those around Trump probably share Netanyahu's vision rather than Trump's right now. People like Elise Stefanik, who wants to be, and probably will be confirmed, the UN ambassador, says Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. You have Mick Huckabee, who they want to make the ambassador to Israel, saying there really is no such thing as a Palestinian.
Trump's coalition is a broad one. It includes these right-wing Christian fundamentalists who see God as some kind of cosmic real estate agent that gives all the land to the Jews. But you also have the tech bros. You have the more pragmatic elements in the mix as well. But I think that Trump, at least when Biden gave tried to give the sense that he gave some lip service to international legal standards, Trump does not. I mean, he doesn't care about U.S. law, given all his indictments, much less international law. So I'm afraid that he will indeed be open to the prospect of annexation, not at the every square meter of the West Bank, at least the areas controlled by Israel, the settlements and the surrounding lands. And so I really don't think that he is going to be willing to push Netanyahu to compromise at all or to crack down on the hardliners within his coalition.
Javier, briefly, I mean, you heard Stephen there say he believed that Biden paid some lip service to international legal norms. Is that how it is seen in Ramallah? And is there anyone there who thinks it could be better with Trump?
First of all, I don't think he even dared to pay a lip service. He contributed to a genocide in Gaza, and he didn't do much to end the colonial settler occupation here in the occupied West Bank. Let's remember that a lot of money is being channeled from organizations in the U.S. to Israeli settlement groups here in the occupied West Bank, including, for example, the Jewish National Fund, under the Biden administration. Very few was done on that sense. I would say, though, that not many people are optimistic with President Trump, particularly after his endorsement of an ethnic cleansing in Gaza.
Javier, thank you very much, and thanks to all our guests today on Inside Story, Stephen Zunis, Mayrev Zunshine and Xavier Abu Eid. Stay tuned to Al Jazeera for comprehensive coverage of the situation in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem and Israel. And remember, there's even more analysis and context on our website at aljazeera.com. To discuss the issues further, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can find us on X, where we are at AJ Inside Story. I'm James Bays. I'll be back here very soon. Until then, from all the team, please stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.